Well, this is Dateline News and Conversation coming to you live this morning from Yalta in the Crimea. My guests are two good friends, and there are no better journalists, commentators, analysts than these two, John Helmer and Dimitri Lascaris. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Regis. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to be here. Happy Victory Day to you all.
Thanks.
All right. I want to start out with this question, and Dimitri, I'm going to throw it to you. Which country is the greatest threat to the world? I don't think there's much debate, but Dimitri, the floor is yours.
Well, without a doubt, it is and has been for decades the United States. By any rational measure, you look at the number of innocents that it has killed, the economies it has destabilized, the democratically elected governments or broad-based popular movements it has undermined by various forms of violence and trickery. It is hands down the United States. And this is a view that is shared according to the Democracy Perception Index 2026 by almost the entire world. This is a view that is not held in, interestingly, just a handful of European states and Japan. The states in question are France, Germany, Poland, Ukraine, Scandinavia. Japan happens to view China as the greatest threat to humanity. And as far as I can tell from this map that I'm looking at, it is the only country in the world that regards China as the greatest threat to humanity. And the only other country that is, besides Russia, which is viewed as the greatest threat by Northern Europeans, and China viewed as the greatest threat by Japan, the only other country that gets status here is Israel, which is viewed by a handful of predominantly Muslim states as the greatest threat to the world, including, by the way, Morocco, whose Western-backed dictatorial regime has normalized with Israel. So the question, of course, is, what is humanity going to do about it?
Dimitri, you're coming through loud and clear, but your video is frozen. But I don't know what we could do about that.
You just blinked, Dimitri. So
yeah, now you're back.
Keep blinking.
The comment that I would make is that Martin Luther King, who was assassinated, geez, I forget exactly when.
67. If I'm not mistaken, it was 1967.
67, shortly after Kennedy. He said that
9 years ago.
Yeah, he said that the greatest purveyor of violence in the world is my country. Dimitri, you mentioned Israel. I think they're pretty dangerous right now with what's happening in the Middle East, and we'll talk about that in a little bit later in the show. John, your thoughts on who the greatest threat to the world is?
Well, I don't disagree that it's United States empire, but empires do that kind of thing. They run extortion rackets. They make violence in order to extract compliance, payment of tribute, in the US case, finance their debts, and so on. And in exchange for that protection, the empire supplies goods, services, obedience, and what have you, at a discount price that the empire uses. That's how empires work. The problem we face since Martin Luther King's death at 67 was how resilient that empire has been. After all, in 67, we were still a year away from the Tet Offensive of 1968, in which the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong combined to inflict the highest level of casualties the United States field had ever suffered in the field in a war situation. Of course, the I remember very well. I was in in Washington and in Boston at the time. The perception was that the U.S. Army had beaten off this Vietnamese offensive. The perception, however, on the U.S. side was that it had inflicted massive casualties. Remembering now that story compared to what Peter Hegseth's briefings, along with General Kane, sound like when they describe the level of destruction they're wreaking on Iran. Same style, same method. Imperial weight wins. Well, it doesn't. But on the other hand, and our audience is bound to be asking, especially covering the distances from Yalta to Crimea down to me, is the empire as resilient as it proved to be after Martin Luther King had that to say? It did survive and come back, you could say, violently after the Vietnam War. Since that Vietnam War, and since the, as it were, period in which successive U.S. administrations, presidential administrations, the Democratic Party, for example, even the Nixon Republicans, seem to be committed to some form of peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union, peaceful coexistence with China, balance, and a reduction of warfare, limiting warfare to outliers, outlying proxy wars in various places, but nothing like the clash that cost almost 60,000 U.S. field casualties in the Vietnam War. Well, the U.S. lesson is get your proxies to fight to the death, but don't expose your men. They're managing to run a battlefield in the Ukraine in which they have a regime, the Zelensky regime, which is proving to be far more resilient than the South Vietnamese regimes in Saigon, and far more determined to waste every Ukrainian life that's necessary in what will be, in their calculation, permanent war against Russia. We now have, for the first time in Asia since the defeat and the signing of the armistice in Tokyo Bay, 45-46, we have the remilitarization of Japan, backed entirely by the United States, on the trumped-up theory that China is the principal threat. I think you left out that India might also consider China to be a significant threat, but relatively small compared to Pakistan. At the same time, what we have to say is the empire as resilient as people don't give it credit for? And if it is, how is it possible to manage the contradictions between, let's say, in Greece, where Dimitri is, very high of popular hostility to U.S. imperial warfare, especially engaging in genocide in Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran? Greek people oppose that. The regime actually actively collaborates in it. I don't know exactly how the difference of opinion among the Danes is, but the Danes are about as hostile to Russia as anyone else in Europe. Greeks are far less hostile. The Spaniards in the middle there somewhere. The English down at the Danish hostile level. Weak regimes like the Merz regime in Germany, even weaker regimes after yesterday's the council elections in England. It's hard to find a weaker regime than Starmer, and yet that regime manages to portray, with its king in Washington, getting a pat on the back from President Trump, a theory of collaboration in imperial expansion, imperial extortion, imperial warfare. I'd say the empire is as dangerous as it ever was, possibly more. And the anti-war movements weaker than they've ever been before.
John, you made several really important points. I think we probably all would agree that the empire is as dangerous, maybe more than ever before. And I'm wondering if you would agree that the reason is because it is not as resilient, because it is in rapid decline. Dimitri, what are your thoughts about this particular point? And then we'll go on to some of the other things John mentioned. But do you think that the empire is in decline and therefore it is even more dangerous than it's ever been?
Well, before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it was certainly true that the United States was an empire and that it was extremely dangerous, but it was not a global hegemon. It was a superpower that held sway over large swaths of the world, but not by any means, firmly ensconced in power around the world. There was a brief moment in the history of this empire where that was true, and it was following the dissolution of the Soviet Union and up until the rise of China and the return of Russia to great power status, which happened about, I would say, within the past 10 years. That's when they really became, I think, capable of resisting US domination to a degree that is without precedent in my lifetime. So the situation has evolved, and as the rise of China and the return of Russia to the status of great power has occurred, the United States has suffered from internal flaws and weaknesses, a number of them, including the deindustrialization of the country, a major development that has weakened the United States greatly, the financialization of its economy, a decline in the quality of education, extreme inequality, growing worse by the day, the tremendous amounts of gun violence and the proliferation of firearms. I could go on and on. So you've seen this corresponding, these two trends of, non-Western powers becoming increasingly strong and assertive militarily and economically and technologically, and the United States becoming weaker and weaker. So I don't think the situation is static, and it is a truly lamentable situation we have here in Europe, as John rightly says, especially here in Greece. You can't imagine a government that is more slavishly devoted to Israel and the United States than the Greek government, and yet so much hostility to both those states amongst the Greek populace. So Europe is definitely a laggard in this regard, and is probably going to be the last contributor to the overthrow of this empire. But I take great hope, and I don't have some kind of I don't see Russia and China through rose-colored glasses. And John and I, in my own program, we've had a lot of discussion about this. What can we really count on the Chinese and Russian governments to do? For example, in the case of Israel, in the case of Palestine, in the case of Iran, and so forth. These are very important questions. I don't want to make it sound as though they're automatically we can count on them for our salvation. But the rise of Russia and China, and now Iran, is a game changer, and this is happening, at the same time, as I mentioned, as the United States is becoming weaker and weaker. The real question here is, I think the writing is all on the wall for the United States empire. I don't think it's necessarily going to meet its demise tomorrow, but the real question is it going to take us all down with it? That's the concern, and that is a real danger that we all confront, especially at this particular moment.
Well, I want to explore that a little bit more. If they lose this epic battle for control of the entire planet, will they take us all down with them in nuclear Armageddon? There's a number of things I want to explore. Dimitri, you raised it. You said you've talked about this with John on your show. Russia, China, Iran. What's going on? Is this that tight of a relationship? Is it a military agreement between these three that Russia and China are going to protect Iran, going to protect Gaza and Palestine? John, I'll throw it over to you, and then Dimitri, you can come back and further explain on that. John?
I can't say it better than Dimitri's just explained it. What your question, Regis, takes us to is the next stage. Inside Russian politics, inside Chinese politics, there are very influential factions that want to make a deal with the Trump administration, that want to, as it were, achieve coexistence, a word that the Chinese have been using in the last few days as their proposal. It's one of the so-called four proposals or propositions of the purported Xi solution to the Middle East. Very vague, very indefinite, but they can carry two meanings. One is coexistence with the Trump administration on terms that would leave Iran severely disadvantaged, or the alternative. Now, I think the only thing I could usefully add to what Dimitri said, and I'm sure we all agree, what Iran is doing was something that the secular Arab regimes, the post-independence Arab regimes in Algeria, in Gamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt, in the Ba'ath Party's rule in Syria and Iraq, Muammar Gaddafi's power in Libya. What they all tried to do was to establish Arab independence, national sovereignty, which they all failed to achieve and were destroyed, physically destroyed in the cases of the Assad family in Syria, physically destroyed in Iraq, physically destroyed in Libya, and so on. What we now have is the surviving power of the Middle East is not Arab, it's Iranian, it's Persian. And what they've been able to demonstrate is something that the Arabs were not able to in that generation, and certainly opposed to by the Arab sheikhs, since they've effectively joined the war of Israel and the United States against Iran. What has Iran shown? In my view, strategically, what it has shown is something that came out of resistance to Germany during the war, in the mountains of Greece, in Yugoslavia, all over the world. It was the belief and the hope that small collectives can, applying their brains, their will, and their relationship to their populations, can defeat the hegemon, can defeat the imperial force. The Vietnamese demonstrated it. Viet Cong demonstrated it on the field, as Iran is demonstrating it on the field. Technologically, what Iran is showing also is that given enough years of learning, notwithstanding all the decapitation strikes they've suffered, all the sabotage, all the internal spying and subversion that Mossad, CIA, MI6 have been capable of inside Iran, what Iran's showing is that at a relatively low cost, with certain technological, intellectual, ideological preconditions, including solidarity, you can fight back and defeat the hegemon on the battlefield if you pick the right points on the battlefield. And one of those points is obviously the Strait of Hormuz. So what Iran is showing is an example to all small countries facing the choice between kowtow and independence. And this is a unique moment. I agree with Dimitri. It's a unique moment demonstrated by the Iranians. Yes, Muammar Gaddafi wanted to try that. Much more than Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein had his own, as it were, Arab imperial ambitions and was destroyed in large measure in Kuwait and then in Iran for those excessive ambitions and his belief, actually, that he'd be supported by the United States in his war against Iran. Well, he paid with his life, and the country has paid with its lives. No, Iran is now the, as it were, example of how you fight when you're small, how you fight when you're weak, how you can win when you're weak in the terms defined by, in this case, the US and its allies. And its allies are, as I just said, Israel and the Sheikdoms, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain and Kuwait. So it's a remarkable demonstration. It's far from certainly over right now. It's too late to have a victory party and a military parade as we're doing in Russia today. But it's a shining example of what hasn't been possible during the, let's say, almost 50 years of the destruction of Arab independence. It remains to be seen that it can be achieved in the Americas. Dimitri knows much more about the Americas than me, but I would say on appearances as far away as I am, Venezuela has fallen, Cuba has yet to fall. So Argentina has fallen, Chile has fallen, Brazil is on its way to falling. I'm saying kind of the obvious stuff, but if the US empire retreats to an America's bastion, including Canada, Mexico, and the others, and which is, I think, the way one could read Vice President Vance's plan for modifying the sequencing of wars they want to run. It's going to be much, much tougher for the Americans, the South Americans, the Canadians. But Iran again shows how to do it.
I don't think either of us, Dimitri or I, would disagree with anything you said. It's a very good overview. One thing I did want to pick up, and you said it in the very beginning, China seems to be looking for peaceful coexistence. What about Russia? Is that Russia's plan as well? Peaceful coexistence? I mean, this Kirill Dmitriev has been meeting with Witkoff, with Kushner and Stewart, just recently added to the group. Putin has been meeting with the same two. Briefly, just I'd like to have your thoughts on what is Russia's plan given Iran, China. John, do you want to clarify what you meant by that? And then we'll go to Dimitri.
I think it's very important, bearing in mind the sensitivity where you are, Regis, to focus on what Kirill Dmitriev did 48 hours ago. What he did was insult the red flag. And under the Russian Criminal Code, Article 354, Section 1, that's a criminal offense. It involves misinterpreting Russian history to the discredit of the Russian and Soviet military achievement in World War II and before World War II. Insulting the red flag is what he did in a tweet in which he attempted to repaint the European Union flag from blue to red, kept the European stars in the circle as the EU flag does, and then in the text accused the European bureaucracies, including all of the European member states, of being leftist and Bolsheviks. Both of those are attacks on the history of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union and in Russia today. Now, it's very clear that the Communist Party is a legal party and a significant part of the opposition in Parliament. And it's about to increase its strength along with all the other opposition parties. Why do I say Dmitriev is guilty of the crime of insulting and diminishing Russian history, Soviet history in this way because he's getting away with it on Victory Day of all days in the Russian calendar. What's happening that Dmitriev represents is a significant factional group around the Kremlin, whispering in President Putin's ear. As I've said before, my sources inform me that they call Dmitriev Putin's whisperer, as if Putin's the horse and Dmitriev is some form of heroic U.S. cowboy. Well, he is a U.S. cowboy. Born in the Ukraine, he is entirely educated in the United States and entirely employed by the United States. And arguably, he still is employed by the United States. He represents a faction in the Kremlin that wants to coexist with the Trump regime and the US government on the basis of economic relations involving significant concessions of Russian state assets to American development in pretty much the same way that the Yeltsin administration offered the US between 1991 and the year 2000. Now, that strength is not diminishing because President Putin protects it, right? So we find something similar, but I am not in the position to name the names. In China, in Beijing, you have very clearly significant differences of opinion around President Xi, and in the Politburo of the Communist Party of China, which is more powerful than the Chinese cabinet, in which there are different views about how to handle how much of a threat long-term strategically or practically and tactically now the Trump administration is. And over the last few days, I've been trying to document the indecision or the decision on the part of President Xi, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, and others, of whether to allow Trump to come to Beijing as scheduled on next week, May 15, May 14. Now, this is very peculiar, and maybe we don't want to get into the tiny news-breaking elements here, but I'm using it like the red flag insulted by Dmitriev is illustrative of my answer to your question. What China is saying, when continually asked for the last 4 days in the foreign ministry briefing, what's the program for Trump's visit to Beijing? And the answer is China maintains communication with the United States on the Trump visit. I have no further information for you at this time. This has been repeated through Friday, yesterday. That means one of two things. Either China is not yet rolling out the red carpet and warning the United States that it will not go ahead with the summit if the US escalates against Iran. First point. And the US is escalating against Iran. We've seen the performative escalation in the Gulf of Oman and in the Strait of Hormuz. One. Two, we've seen Rubio announce in the last few hours new sanctions on Chinese companies for allegedly providing satellite and other forms of intelligence to assist Iran in targeting US bases and so forth and so on in the war to date. So the US is escalating, and the Chinese have to say, are we really going to accept a visit that will involve us in the appearance of collaboration in new escalations against Iran, which we've promised most recently Foreign Minister Araghchi, who was in Beijing a couple of days back, 3 days ago. So the Chinese are either indecisive or decisive or simply concealing. They aim to receive Trump without making it look as if they are until the very last minute. I don't know. I'm not an expert on China, I can't pretend to understand, except I can read and I can watch. And some of these questions are asked by Russian reporters at the Chinese Foreign Ministry. So I take these two examples of, as it were, active news-making events to show that there are factions, in powerful ones, in Beijing and in Moscow that want to coexist on US empire terms. And they're being resisted by other factions. And you were saying, Regis, before we came on air, that you've seen essays by Russian think tankers like Sergei Karaganov, and you've seen the public statements by Dmitry Medvedev, the Deputy Secretary of the Security Council, the former president, all of which go to the alternative, the alternative to the Dmitriev line in Russian politics, the alternative to whoever it is in China wants coexistence and a hug with Trump when he arrives on May 14. That seems to me to be, right now, the breaking news of this factional fight in each capital.
Yeah, you made many good points. And the thing I wanted to add is on the other side of the Dmitriev coalition, you have the hardliners like Karaganov and Medvedev, and I'm sure the same thing is happening in China. There've got to be hardliners in China, and it's like Xi and Putin are having to balance what's going on.
Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to differ. We've been through the Yeltsin period. I lived through it. A lot of Russians didn't survive it. I wouldn't call Karaganov's essay, Medvedev's speeches, the consensus of the Security Council as a hard line. I'd call it Russian realism. What I'd call the Dmitriev line is some words I wouldn't want to publish, but I'll just say these are, let's call it the pro-American line. Some in Russia call it the fifth column line. And I presume there are similar ways of characterizing this in China. However, Chinese coverage of domestic politics of this level is a lot less democratic, a lot less open, a lot less available for us to interpret than the political discussions in Moscow. Not hard line, not soft line, not hawks, not doves. One is national interest, national realism. The other is imperial coexistence. I'd call them that.
Oh, well, thank you.
Empire toadies, national independence, if you like.
Dimitri, I want to change the subject a little bit because I know you're interested in this, but your major interest has been what's going on in Iran, the Middle East, and specifically the Straits of Hormuz. John mentioned that this ceasefire really it doesn't exist. They've been attacking, I don't know, asymmetrically maybe, or just a little tit for tat. But what are your thoughts, Dimitri? Is the situation in the Gulf the last couple of days, does it represent an escalation?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. I'm glad you turned to that subject, but I do want to just add a couple of thoughts to what John said on this very important question. And this is where I think I'll briefly highlight where I think John and I part company on this issue. I do believe there are factions within the US and Russian governments that seek coexistence. I think that, in fact, virtually the entire Russian political elite and the entire Chinese political elite would be perfectly happy to coexist with the United States were that possible. And so if the United States were to retreat to the Americas, I think they would be happy to say, well, we're not going to intervene in your domination of that part of the world as long as we remain secure and prosperous in our own spheres of influence. The problem here is that the United States will not give them that option. The United States isn't interested in peaceful coexistence. And I think that the people who are ultimately making decisions in Russia and China have figured that out. And maybe there are a few, people like Kirill Dmitriev who continue to live in some kind of a fantasy world where they think peaceful coexistence is possible. And we're all going to get rich, together and cork open the champagne in, luxurious 5-star hotels. Put aside our national differences, but that's just not an option that's available. So the United States is committing the classic blunder, which I think Zbigniew Brzezinski talked about. He's not the only, foreign policy theorist out of the West who saw it as being the ultimate blunder. They're driving China, Russia, and Iran together. They're forcing them to enter into some sort of an alliance, whether de facto or de jure, to oppose the project of U.S. global hegemony. I don't think they're foolish enough to believe that this is possible any longer. Now, there may be a regime change in the United States one day, which makes it possible. But both the Democrats and the Republicans until now have shown that they care only about one thing, and that is global domination. And they will do anything to achieve it and preserve it. I have great difficulty believing that the decision makers in Moscow and Beijing don't understand this at this stage. Now, to turn to your question, yes, it is an escalation, no question about it. It's interesting that both the United States and Iran say that the ceasefire remains in effect. I think that this is absolutely and demonstrably false. They are not only, the Americans are not only striking targets in the Strait of Hormuz, vessels on the high seas, they are also and outside of the Strait of Hormuz, in the Gulf of Oman, and even further afield than that, they're committing acts of piracy against Iranian flagged vessels. But they've also struck now land-based targets. They appear to have struck port facilities or other facilities in Bandar Abbas, which is the largest Iranian city lying on the Strait of Hormuz, the island of Keshem, which is the part of Iran and the largest island in the Persian Gulf. And they appear also to have hit some facilities in Minab, in the south, to the south of Bandar Abbas, which, by the way, is the site of that horrific massacre on the first day of this war of aggression, where U.S. Tomahawk missiles murdered 168 children and school teachers. And Iran, although it denies having struck the United Arab Emirates, my personal view is that it probably did retaliate by striking targets in the UAE. So we're now well beyond the ceasefire. The ceasefire is dead as a doornail. I think the reason why Trump insists that the ceasefire, he has several motivations for insisting the ceasefire is still in effect. Number one, he's got a concern about the War Powers Act. He wants to claim that the clock stopped running because the war is over. And he doesn't want the clock under the War Powers Act to start running again until he wants to delay that as long as possible, theoretically speaking, to give himself the maximum amount of time to carry out his mission, which is to destroy the Islamic Republic and Iran as a functioning sovereign state. That's the ultimate goal of the United States and Israel. It's not regime change. It's the destruction of Iran as a functioning sovereign state. And he needs time to do that in his own mind. So he's going to insist as long as possible that there's a ceasefire. He also has a base that's becoming increasingly disgruntled with this war. So he's posturing as a person who's trying to maintain peace. And he's also trying to suppress the price of oil. And the more the markets are convinced that peace is just around the corner, the less they're going to panic about the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So he'll continue to lie for as long as possible about the ceasefire being in effect. The Iranians, for a different reason, are saying the ceasefire is in effect. Because if they say, when the U.S. is saying that the ceasefire is in effect, if they say, no, it isn't, the ceasefire is over, then Trump can say, aha, Iran is starting the war again, and put the blame on them. So as long as, Donald Trump is lying through his teeth and saying the ceasefire remains in effect, the Iranians have a strong incentive to not contradict him. But the bottom line is it's over. And I think from here, what we're going to see is a progressive escalation. The speed with which it will happen is, I don't know. It may happen gradually over a period of weeks. It may happen all of a sudden. I think the real turning point when we will know that we are in a full-blown all-out war is when they start bombing Tehran again. That could happen in the next few days. It might happen weeks from now. But the most important point is the Strait of Hormuz remains shut. I just saw a report, a credible report, that there hasn't been a single vessel, commercial vessel, that has gone through the Strait of Hormuz in 3 days. So it is even more shut now than it was previously, which means the global economy is heading towards cataclysmic crisis. And, unless and until the United States government is prepared to make serious concessions to Iran, we are going to find ourselves in an economic maelstrom.
John? I can't add anything more to what Dimitri said. I second and agree with all of the points, all of them. Yes, and the most important of the operational war issues is, yes, the U.S.-Israeli war aim is the total destruction of Iran as a functioning state. They might have settled for regime change if they could have achieved that war aim by regime change, but they've already failed at that. So the alternative is the destruction of the entire country and its economy. And you can see all sorts of evidence when Trump talks about the exploding Iranian oil fields and destroying Kharg Island. He's talking about genocide, the destruction of a state, the destruction of an economy. That's a genocide. Yes.
I want to ask this question. Dimitri, you briefly alluded to it, but the closure of the strait and the impact that it's having on the entire global economy, shipping lanes, there's nobody that's escaping this, including the United States. Where do you see this going? And I may be making too much of a stretch, but when the United States imposed an oil embargo in 1941 on Japan, Japan retaliated by attacking Pearl Harbor. Everybody knows that. Do you think that because of the horrific impact that's already had the closure of the straits, that somebody might resort to using a horrific weapon? And I think, for example, some recent articles about Pakistan and Saudi Arabia having a nuclear umbrella. Would anybody be crazy enough, including Israel or any other country that possesses this weapon, to realize that they have to do something or they're going to just disappear? Dimitri.
Well, the United States has already used these weapons of mass destruction and did so at a time when Japan was on the verge of surrender. And it used them on civilian populations, not one, but two. The United States government knowingly incinerated tens of thousands of Japanese children. Let's be very clear what it did. It knew that it was going to mass murder tens of thousands of innocent Japanese children, amongst other civilians, at a time when it could have achieved victory over Japan without the use of these weapons of mass destruction. So why would anybody doubt, in light of history, that this could happen again? Not only might it happen again, but over time it will happen again. If we were to retain nuclear arsenals in this world indefinitely, it is only a question of when, not if. Somebody will use nukes, period. And right now, in my view, the greatest candidate, the most likely candidate to do that is Israel, with the United States following not far behind. Israel, I mean, there's absolutely no scruples, no sense of human decency in the leadership of Israel. And in addition, unfortunately, sadly, the polling data suggests that a large majority of the Israeli population is equally committed to violence, domination, bloodshed, as the leadership of the country. And what is the effective deterrent for Iran? Unless and until it develops a nuclear weapon, Israel may feel that it can strike Iran with nukes without fear of any, cataclysmic retaliation. So I think there's a significant, I'm not saying it's likely, but I think there's a significant realistic possibility of Israel using nukes. And I think that's also true of the United States. And ultimately, as I say, in the long run, these weapons will be used. We need to get rid of them as quickly as humanly possible for the salvation of humanity.
John?
Again, I'm agreeing with Dimitri. 2 points. One is to reinforce what Dimitri said, that the principal threat of the use of tactical nuclear weapons is Israel against Iran, especially targets from that would be purportedly nuclear facilities. What we've seen is a demonstration that the United States made with the so-called Isfahan pilot rescue operation. That was really a rehearsal for an attempt by U.S. forces, special forces, to capture Iranian nuclear facilities. The, as it were, operational plan of that action was spelled out in an essay that appeared in the Washington Post a couple of days before the operation itself began as one of the options for U.S. escalation in Iran. The U.S. operationally tested whether it's possible to achieve its war aims against Iran's so-called nuclear program by conventional means. The Isfahan operation rescued the pilot, but failed at the real operational objective, which was to capture nuclear facilities allegedly containing the enriched uranium stockpiles. That failed. If that failed, then arguably, exactly as Dimitri said, the Israeli argument with the Joint Chiefs of Staff is that only tactical nuclear weapons are capable now, and conventional operational options will not work against Iran. That, I think, is the Israeli argument. And if you read Axios, which is basically an Israeli mouthpiece in Washington, you can see the logic, you can see the reporting the Israelis are feeding at Washington through a purported Washington paper written by a man called Barak David, but he's essentially an Israeli mouthpiece. You can see it working out that way. So that's the primary risk. I don't see any possibility that the so-called Saudi-Pakistani alliance would involve the transfer of nuclear weapons for the use of the Saudis to protect themselves against the Iranians. I don't believe that's likely at all, but it's a Pakistani political question. It's an Indian political question. It's a Saudi political question. It's beyond my competence, and we don't have the time for it. On the issue of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the two U.S. bombings that ended World War II in Japan. My only direct experience was with a member of the Allied Council for Japan, who was my professor many, many years ago. His name was McMahon Ball. He was the Australian representative on the Allied Council of Japan, the occupying authority. He was bitterly hostile to General MacArthur, who ran the Allied Council of Japan as a pocket organization. And ultimately, the Australian government caved in under US pressure and got rid of McMahon Ball as the Australian delegate because he was too resistant to MacArthur in the way in which the occupation destroyed Japanese unions, the future of the Socialist Party in Japan, et cetera, et cetera. I won't get into all of that. But Mac Ball and I was his student, and I was a very young student at the time, but one of the issues that we looked at, one of the issues as a young graduate student, honors graduate student at the time, wanted to understand was why did the US use two nuclear weapons? Why Hiroshima and then Nagasaki? We went through all of the evidence, including all the evidence of US intelligence intercepts and so forth. And it was McMahon Ball's view as an independent Australian at the time at war with Japan, that while there was a US case for saving US lives for a conventional invasion of Japan to end the war, while there was a case to be made that notwithstanding all of the evidence that some parts of the Japanese decision-making leadership wanted to surrender, there is enough evidence to have justified, at least in retrospect, I'm not making this case myself, for the for the bombing of Hiroshima. Okay, but the bombing of Nagasaki, completely different. And the evidence there is that President Truman at the time, made that demonstration to Stalin. That was a US attempt beginning and continuing the war against the Soviet Union. That was a demonstration to Stalin. We can do this to you. And that we know from, for example, all of the nuclear war plans, the nuclear bombing plans. I'm suddenly forgotten his name. The guy who published the Pentagon Papers. I forget, Ellsberg, Daniel Ellsberg. Yes, Daniel Ellsberg not only published the Pentagon Papers, but many years later he published the U.S. nuclear warfare bombing plans for the Soviet Union. It's my view that the U.S. bombed Nagasaki for the purpose of threatening and deterring Stalin. So that's a mere historical note, but it's relevant now. The U.S. used those nuclear weapons against civilians in Japan, not only to ensure surrender of Japan, but it was the beginning of what Truman and his advisors thought, including truly Trump-level violent individuals like Curtis LeMay, who was the general commanding strategic war plans in the US at the time. It was their view that they should do it to the Soviet Union next. Okay? So I think we could take from this historical example with a little bit more information, the same answer that Dimitri's given, with a bit more evidence of a slightly different kind. The trouble is the Japanese know it. And yet, right now, they're heading towards not just remilitarization, they're heading towards nuclearization. They're going to develop as quickly as they can the capability to go nuclear. Why? Because they're facing, they think, Chinese nuclear weapons and the potential for North Korean nuclear weapons and Russian nuclear weapons. Japan is going to go nuclear as quickly as they can with US assistance for the same strategic reasons that the US assists Israel. So we face the serious possibility, exactly as Dimitri said, that it's almost inevitable when you get this kind of remilitarization. Japan in the East, Germany in Europe, Israel in the Middle East, all intent on totally destroying their adversaries. It's not hopeful at all.
John, may I just ask one question? I learned recently, I'm not sure that this is accurate, but I find it completely believable. I should have, if this is true, I should have known it a long time ago, but I didn't. That Churchill actually wanted to continue the war against the Soviet Union. It wasn't just some nutbars inside the US government at the time. And ultimately, for, I guess, reasons related to opposition within his military, I don't know exactly why, he didn't get his wish, but he wanted to drive the Soviet Union by force of arms from Eastern Europe and ultimately cause the demise of the communist government. Is that true?
I have to say, I don't know, but it sounds a reliable version of Churchill's thinking. Churchill was also intent on destroying the Greek Communist Party.
That I know, yes.
Launching the Civil War, it was the British who launched the Civil War in Athens. You know that better than me. So Churchill is capable of the most extraordinary cruelty towards Russia. He was there when the use of gas bombs were used against Russia, against what was considered the Bolshevik regime, the communist regime, in the British intervention in Arkhangelsk. Churchill was also involved in the use of gas weapons then. So I don't know enough about Churchill. Don't actually want to. I'm short of time.
I don't want to take over John's interview, but it seems maybe, John, this would be a good time for us to talk about Dmitry Medvedev's recent letter about the failure to denazify Europe. I don't know if you wanted to talk about that, but that seemed to me to be quite a powerful statement and one that's very relevant to our conversation today.
Yeah, that's where I wanted to go. Before I do that, and I'm not in a hurry to finish this, I've been scrolling across the bottom of the screen. John Helmer's website, Dances with Bears, and right now, Dimitri Lascaris' website, Reason to Resist. I encourage everybody to go to both. And in terms of Dimitri's Substack, help him increase the viewership by liking and subscribing to his channel. What I wanted to say was, in terms of the potential of the realistic, existential, and maybe imminent threat of nuclear war, we're talking about all of Europe. These crazies from London all the way to Finland talking about nuclear weapons. In France and England are talking about maybe creating a nuclear umbrella because they're afraid of what Russia might do. John, I'm going to go to you first on that. I mean, this for me is really terrifying. And that's not even to mention what I've been thinking is the possibility of a nuclear war because of what's going on in Ukraine with American support. John?
Well, there are too many variables. I'll pull them apart a bit. I understand the French approach to enhancing their nuclear deterrent to be typical French Euro independence. It's barely disguised as improving deterrence and balance of nuclear force with Russia. It's really aimed at establishing French capability to deter their traditional enemies. Who are the traditional enemies of France? Great Britain and Germany. Who's the more threatening to France for obvious reasons, for historical reasons? The Germans. The Germans are. The Germans remain. Merz is simply the mouthpiece of German, but potential to acquire the capability to use nuclear weapons against its enemies. And that's not simply Russia. So I don't see that French efforts as much more than, it's not strategically minor, balancing the nuclear, let's say, balance of force in Europe versus the British and the Germans and the US with the Germans. That's one point. The second is that the the US is, leaving aside this silly pretense of withdrawing 5,000 men from Germany that Trump is going through because he didn't like what Merz had to say. I mean, if ever there was a hegemon behaving like a Roman emperor, punishing somebody for saying a sentence that happened to be true but sounded insulting to the emperor, it's this case. Ignore the 5,000 troops being withdrawn from Germany as a serious exercise in US withdrawal from Europe. They're not withdrawing. They're sequencing away from a losing battlefield to Germany, to Poland, to Finland, to the Baltic states. And they're taking, and Greece too, they're taking nuclear weapons with them. They're taking the capability, the dual capable launcher systems to launch nuclear warheads from the Mediterranean all the way up to Finland and Greenland. That's what they're doing. And yes, it increases the pressure on Russia considerably. What more can I say? I'm agreeing with both of you.
Dimitri, your thoughts on Europe and all the talk now about becoming nuclear power because of the fear of Russia.
There's a serious danger of that happening. I mean, you look at the comments that are coming out of people like Friedrich Merz and Macron and Starmer, virtually the entire political elite in the EU. If they believe half of what they say, which is that, you know, Russia wants to reconstitute the Soviet Empire and will be, you know, descending upon the capitals of Western Europe in short order if something isn't done to deter the Russian bear. If they believe even half of that, then yes, this is a project which they may well undertake. And I'm afraid that there are probably enough people who are brainwashed in the major European countries to allow it to happen, because they believe that this is, you know, Russia. As this poll that we started our discussion with demonstrates, you know, a majority of people living in Germany and France and Eastern Europe appear to believe that the greatest threat to humanity is Russia, which is utter nonsense. So could it happen? Absolutely, it could happen. We are heading in the wrong direction from the perspective of nuclear non-proliferation. What we are witnessing is likely to be the proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Yes.
At a time when we should be dismantling these arsenals as quickly as possible. Now, I despite all of this, I want to say I am not pessimistic. I don't consider myself to be pessimistic or optimistic by nature. I try to be realistic. And I see a way out of this impasse, and it's revolutionary. It's people being going into the streets and overthrowing these regimes, to be perfectly blunt about it. And one may say, well, there's little evidence that that's going to happen. This economic crisis that the United States is going to bring upon us may be the gift that won't stop giving. Because once people can no longer feed their children, you're going to see some serious political instability in the West. And that's exactly what we are about to witness.
I want to thank you both. And so many things have surfaced in this discussion that we have to come back together again. Dimitri, I know you're traveling, but what's going to happen in the next few days, I think, is really critical. And it's all focusing on Iran and what the United States is going to do. And will Trump finally deal that one big blow that he talks about? So I'd like to bring us back together again as soon as all three of us are available. And Dimitri, I think that hinges a lot on you because you're traveling. But there's so much more that is so significant and important that I can't wait to have you back. Thanks so much.
Thank you.